Good afternoon. My name is Jamie Hawk. I'm a lawyer with the ACLU of Washington and a co-chair of the Civil Rights and Social Justice Section Civil Rights and Equal Opportunity Committee. I will be the moderator for today's discussion. We are thrilled to be presenting a timely panel entitled Access to the Vote, the Ballot, and the Mailbox. Sponsored by the ABA section of Civil Rights and Social Justice, this panel is one of many in a series of rapid response webinars. We are actively planning additional program on a variety of issues, so please visit americanbar.org/CRSJ for updates on these programs. Before we go to our program and how today will work, it's my pleasure to turn it over to Angela J. Scott, the 2020-21 chair of the ABA section of Civil Rights and Social Justice, for a few remarks. Welcome, Angela.
Thank you, Jamie, and thank you, everyone. Many thanks to you and the entire Civil Rights and Equal Opportunity Committee for planning this very timely panel. So it's my pleasure to welcome everyone who is watching. Before I begin, and I say this before I say anything, I just want to make sure that you all know that I'm speaking in my personal capacity and not on behalf of my employer. Nothing that I or any of the panelists say today represents any views or of any component of the federal government. So I just want to make that clear. In this day and age of a global pandemic, who would have thought that we would be living through something like this? But obviously over 210,000 Americans have passed away from COVID. So it is imperative that voters are aware of all of their options so that they can cast their ballot safely during this upcoming pandemic. And we know that certain voters had obstacles and barriers to voting even before the pandemic. So, for example, disabled and elderly individuals who are in long-term care facilities face challenges that you and I may not. And those barriers are obviously increased because of this pandemic. There are also homeless individuals and folks who, for whatever reason, list a PO box as their resident address. And so they aren't easily able to cast a vote. And we all know in various states and jurisdictions that there are new laws requiring purging from voter rolls or requiring identification that may not be easily available to some people. And so all of these constitute obstacles that can suppress the vote in many cases. And so to this end, the Civil Rights and Social Justice section is engaging in multiple efforts to ameliorate some of these obstacles. We want to highlight these efforts and these things through our programming and through some of the other initiatives that we have planned. For example, we're engaging in multiple efforts to provide our members the opportunity to volunteer and serve the community in ways that will help ensure that people can vote this upcoming election. Our section, along with other ABA entities, are helping people, attorneys, to become poll workers through our ABA Poll Worker Esquire initiative. And those who can't do that, for those who can't be official poll workers or who can't commit to a long day of service like that, there are election protection opportunities. So the Civil Rights and Social Justice section is helping to facilitate connecting our members and connecting attorneys with nonpartisan organizations, some of whom we've partnered with in the past, Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under the Law, National Bar Association. We are helping to connect individuals who want to serve in shifts to help engage in nonpartisan election protection efforts. Our members are also working hard to create a toolkit that's designed for assisting individuals and community organizations in helping others. We all know that there are many, many, many organizations that are well-intentioned. We just want to make sure that they have all of the facts and information and tools that will be helpful for them to be able to help other people. And finally, in addition to this one, we have wonderful upcoming programming designed to take a deep dive into overcoming some of these obstacles. So obviously we have this wonderful program, and coming up soon, we have another program called Obstacles at Every Turn. Native Vote in a World of Coronavirus. We have our 5th annual State of Voting Rights program coming up. And we have another program on dignity, rights, and democracy, a conversation. So we really encourage you all to join us for all of this, join the section, join us in all of these efforts. I'm going to have to jump off, but again, I want to thank you, Jamie. I want to thank all of the panelists, all of the committee members and the staff for putting this together. Elections are quintessential to our democracy. And through our nonpartisan programming and through our community service voting initiatives this year, our members of the Civil Rights and Social Justice section are committed to being a part of solutions and a part of the nonpartisan effort to ensure that all eligible votes are counted. So we look forward to you joining us. I think that's it. I'm going to turn it back over to Jamie.
Wonderful. Thank you so very much for those comments, Angela. It's wonderful to see you today.
You too.
During today's program, we encourage you to ask questions of our panelists through the Q&A, not the chat function. If you do not see the controls, please ensure your screen is not idle. We will address questions at the end of the panel. We will be recording or sharing a recording of this program to everyone who has registered so that you can share it widely with your networks. There will be captions available on the recording. And with that, we're thrilled to bring you today's program entitled Access to the Ballot, Access to the Vote, the Ballot and the Mailbox. There are 4 members of the panel. You will hear from them for several minutes each about their perspectives and expertise on the issues being discussed today. Then we will open up for discussion and questions from the audience. I will provide a more full bio of each panelist before they speak. For purposes of initial introductions, I'm pleased to welcome our esteemed panel of elected officials, scholars, and practitioners. The Honorable Kim Wyman, Secretary of State of Washington, the Honorable Ellen Rosenblum, Attorney General of Oregon, Law Professor Justin Levitt of Loyola School of Law, and Attorney Jennifer Holmes, Assistant Counsel with NAACP, Legal Defense and Education Fund. Welcome and thank you all. More Americans are expected to vote by mail in the upcoming presidential election than in any previous election in our country, due to changes made by states in response to the pandemic. More voters are likely to cast their ballots by mail than go to the polls in person. But most voters have also not voted by mail before, and that may lead to some uncertainty about what's ahead in the next few weeks. First, we will hear from Secretary Wyman. Kim Wyman is Washington's 15th Secretary of State. First elected in 2012, she is serving her 2nd term and is only the 2nd female Secretary of State in Washington's history. Prior to being elected to this office, Kim served as Thurston County Elections Director for nearly a decade and was elected Thurston County Auditor from 2001 to 2013. Secretary Wyman, as Washingtonians, we have had vote by mail for a number of years now. Can you please tell us about Washington State's experience with vote by mail and how you address issues of safety and security?
I would be happy to. Thank you so much for allowing me to be on this panel, and thank you for the work that the committee and the bar has done. This is a really important topic and a very important year to do this work. I'm going to take a minute to bring up, hopefully if the tech agrees, a PowerPoint presentation and just walk through what I would term the speed version of Washington state elections. And are you all seeing that? Is that okay? I'm not, ironically. That's kind of fun. Oh, I love technology. All right. Oh, there we go. It's okay. Well, here, let me talk a little bit while I'm trying to get the tech to work. So Here, there we go. So here in Washington State, and I think this is true of election officials across the country, we're election geeks by nature, like many of you are law geeks, and we are kind of like the offensive line in football. We don't really, you guys don't pay attention to us until something usually goes wrong, or we have a pandemic, and now everyone needs to vote by mail. So let me real quick in the next 5 to 10 minutes share with you Washington's kind of path to this and what we do here to ensure that every eligible Washingtonian has a right to register to vote and also have their ballot cast. So let me begin kind of giving you scope and scale perspective of Washington elections. We have right now about 4.7 million registered voters, and I anticipate by election day we will be knocking on the door of 5 million. And we've had a number of laws over the last 20 years that have really catapulted Washington forward to be in a position that, quite frankly, like Oregon, was very good for a pandemic, it turns out. It begins with voter ID. In 2006, following the closest governor's race in the country's history in 2004, Washington did adopt voter ID laws that have really served our voters well. We have not had issues with suppression, and we even withstood a Brennan Center challenge. And I'm really proud of the way we rolled it out because it wasn't politicized too much, and it has really worked well with our system. We've had online voter registration since 2008, and we have been a vote by mail state completely since 2011. Some of in the last 10 years, the activities and advancements that we've made really have expanded access, starting, of course, with prepaid postage that we started doing in 2018. And in 2019 was really the huge expansion of access in Washington State. So same day registration, automatic voter registration, and pre-registration of 16 and 17-year-olds. And all of these really great advancements that I'm really proud to have been part of. And I'm not taking credit for it. It's just I've been an election administrator getting to enact these laws. We build out the compensating controls, the security measures that really balance it out. And one of the big things that we did in 2019 was roll out a near real-time statewide voter registration system that we call VoteWA. And this is really the backbone for a lot of the activity that we do and the success that we have in balancing out that access and security. So here in Washington, our ballots will be available 20 days before election to any voter who wants to come in and get one. They have to be in the mail by our county auditors. In King County, it's the elections director, 18 days prior to election day. And we have over 500 ballot drop boxes that voters can drop their ballot in if they don't want to put it into the USPS. And we're very thankful for that right now, because certainly there's been a lot of interesting reporting about the USPS. Here in Washington State, and this is one area where Oregon and Washington differ, and I'm sure my colleague from Oregon will talk about it in a moment. Washington is a postmark state. So as long as we receive a ballot with a postmark on or before Election Day, within the 20 days following Election Day, that ballot can be counted and is counted as long as it meets all the other eligibility requirements. And let me stop here for a minute and just talk a little bit about what we do to, again, inspire that confidence, because certainly the president and the attorney general at the U.S. Attorney General have made some pretty disparaging remarks about the security and the safety of vote by mail. And I've been running vote by mail elections for almost 20 years now. And I can tell you those security controls that we have in place, like checking and verifying every signature of every return ballot against a signature on the voter registration record, is really our linchpin for security. We make sure that that signature matches, and then we of course don't want to disenfranchise a valid vote. So we contact a voter if their signature doesn't match or is missing. Sometimes voters forget to sign their envelopes, and we give that voter an opportunity for a second chance. And that, I think, is a really empowering move that we started probably 15 years ago. But it's also another security check, because I guarantee you, if you receive a letter from your county election official that says your ballot's been returned and your signature doesn't match and you haven't voted, you're going to be on the phone right away to make sure that that ballot is has been set aside and is going to be prosecuted if it is a crime. Another thing that we're seeing a lot of here in Washington that is a little bit newer in the last probably 5 to 10 years is what we call the ballot chase. And that is where campaigns will get that list of voters after Election Day whose signatures do not match. They'll go through, they'll find their supporters, and they'll go in and follow up on that as well. This really dramatically helps us reduce the rejection rate. It's a good thing. And I think that that's another reason why it's good that our counties reach out to voters, because it equalizes it for everyone. It's not just the really well-financed campaigns or well-organized campaigns that have that advantage. Another thing that we have with our new vote WA system is the voters have the ability to, I totally missed this, register to vote online, and they can do that up till 8 days before Election Day. And then we do still have in-person same-day registration up through 8 o'clock election night. But voters can track their ballot through our Vote WA portal as well. So once they put it into the mail stream or put it into the ballot drop box and the county receives it, they can follow that path of signature checking to it being ready to count. And they can have an assurance that their ballot was received and is ready to be counted. And more importantly, if there is a problem, they can contact election officials to rectify that. As I said earlier, we have a 21-day certification period in Washington. So those late arriving ballots that have valid postmarks can still be counted. Now, one of the things that I think is important to get on all of your radar, if it's not already, is that I think we're going to see a real shift in November and that most of the country has not seen before. And I think Oregon and Washington voters are used to this. I think our counterparts across the country are going to be shocked to find out that they're not going to know who won the election on election night. And I think that most voters think that that is a final answer. And I think all of the lawyers on this call know that that is not the case, because we're working after Election Day to certify those results. But as you see in this bar graph, this is a typical return pattern that we see. And this is from our 2020 August primary election. What I can tell you, though, is this is off the chart in a way I've never seen before, because typically, we do see about 50 to 60% of our ballots come in election week because of that postmark element. But you notice that we see a spike not only on Wednesday after Election Day, but Thursday. And what we saw in August is that the volume was so crushing for our counties, who are very good at processing ballots, that it took them an entire day to get through a lot of their late arriving ballots that came through the ballot drop boxes that, by the way, close at 8 o'clock election night. So I mentioned this because I think this is a trend we're going to see across the country. Those late arriving ballots are going to happen. And I worry about states like Oregon, I'll be honest, because you potentially are going to see hundreds of thousands of ballots that get to their election offices with valid postmarks arriving the day after the election and will not be eligible to be counted in those states. And I think we already are seeing litigation on that front across the country, and I think we will see more of it following Elections Day. But this is definitely going to delay the results in states across the country. This was a New York Times graphic that I just thought was great. The dark blue states are states that have a history of vote by mail elections. The orange states or gold states are states that have, how shall we say, very restrictive absentee laws. And we're going to see probably the lowest turnout of mail-in voters in those states. And all of the remaining states are ramping up their operations. And we are going to have a wide array of absentee ballot processing and election activity that is vote by mail. I can assure you that my colleagues have been reaching out to our office and to our county partners, and we're all sharing a lot of information, probably the best thing that comes out of all of the preparations for cybersecurity. So we have been really working, trying to get ready for 2020. One of the things, the last thing I'll leave you with is we have a national hashtag called Get Out the Vote, or excuse me, my brain is full. Is Trusted Info 2020. And that's really trying to drive people to trusted sources of information, like your county election officers, your state election officers, or the Bar Association, ACLU, organizations that you can trust for information, so that people know what they need to do. So with that, I hope I hit my time right. And thank you for letting me present.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Secretary Wyman. We will next hear from Attorney General Rosenblum. A former federal prosecutor and state trial and appellate judge, Ellen Rosenblum was first elected as Oregon's 17th Attorney General in November 2012 and was reelected to a second term November 8th, 2016. She is the first woman to serve as Oregon Attorney General. She has served as secretary of the American Bar Association, as well as chair of the ABA section of state and local government law. Attorney General Rosenblum, you represent another one of the 5 states that exclusively votes by mail. I know you've been dealing with some recent litigation related to vote by mail. Can you tell us about this and any other relevant legal issues?
Sure. Thank you so much, Jamie. I just want to go like this when you say we're one of those vote by mail states with Secretary Wyman. Yay. Yay for us. But look, we understand it's a lot more difficult for states that haven't been to get up to speed. And I'm so proud of those in so many states who are really making this effort because it is so important. Any state that allows for absentee voting, which we used to call it that, can fairly easily make this transition in a year where it is so important to do that. So let me start by just saying thank you to you, Jamie, for inviting me to the section of civil rights and social justice. I love working with you. Our sections do a lot together. And thank you to Secretary Wyman and my fellow panelists. And for everyone who's shown up virtually this morning to talk about election protection. I see that we have about 250 people on this panel webinar. So thank you so much for joining us. Obviously, elections are at the heart of our democracy. And this year, states are facing unprecedented challenges from the global coronavirus pandemic and frankly, concerns about diminished faith in the election process. I think Secretary Wyman would agree with me that our 2 states, Washington and Oregon, have had a bit less scrambling to do than many other states. And that's because our existing vote by mail, what I call vote at home systems inherently solve the problem of potentially crowded voting polling places. And the infrastructure for getting ballots to people is already in place in our states. And I think she mentioned 20 years, same here. It's actually been 40 years in Oregon, unofficially, and officially 20 years since we voted it in statewide for both state and federal for all of our elections. So Oregon's system of mail voting is very similar to what we just heard about Washington's process, although there are some differences. And thank you for flagging your concerns, Kim, but I can allay those to some degree. So in Oregon, registered voters automatically receive a ballot in the mail with a postage paid, as of this past year, a return envelope, and an optional, I should emphasize, secrecy sleeve. It's not required to use it, but it's a nice thing to have. They typically arrive a few weeks before Election Day, it's about 2 weeks, and they can be returned by dropping them in the mail, yes, or by returning them to our official Dropbox locations. I think you mentioned you have about 500 in Washington, and I think we have about a comparable number here. So this is an important statistic. Historically, about 40%, only 40% of people have used the mail in Oregon, and 60% have used the drop boxes. And so that's why I can allay your concerns a little bit, Kim, because we really emphasize in Oregon getting your ballot in early. And so we don't worry about the postmark as much as you might think we should. And that's because we're really good at getting our ballots in early. And if we don't, we put them in the drop boxes. 60% of Oregonians do not use the mail. They use the drop boxes, which are all over the place. They're at all the election offices, the county election offices, but they're also down at the Pioneer Square. They're over at the A-Boy Lumberyard. They're at places where it's convenient for people to drive up. You don't even have to get out of your car. So that's really important. You can also have the option of going to a county election office and voting there with assistance during that 2-week period. So there are not long lines. It's not like waiting in line and having to be 6 feet apart in the rain potentially and the potential exposure to the virus. Instead, you have the opportunity to get that help at any time that the office is open during that 2-week period. One difference is that Oregon requires our ballot to be returned by 8 p.m. on election day. So a postmark on election day is not good enough. And that means that if you're going to use the mail, you do need to allow time for delivery. And the post office this year is recommending 1 full week, right? So we are telling people maybe even more than a week if you do intend to use the mail. So given the extent to which Oregon has successfully relied on the mail system for elections, I was very concerned, and I know that you were as well in Washington, when news broke out about the changes that the Postmaster General was unilaterally making. So I want to talk about that a little bit. The Postal Service was dismantling mail sorting machines, was disallowing overtime, and requiring trucks to leave at scheduled times, even if that meant that mail got left behind in the post offices. They were also suggesting that they would no longer treat outgoing election mail as first-class mail unless states paid the higher first-class rate. The Post Office General Counsel was blunt about the impacts these changes could have on election mail. Oregon, for example, got a letter indicating that the service in our state would still be slower than it has ever been. In fact, the suggestion was that if our election officials used the time allotted to design ballots and got everything in place, voters actually might need to send their ballots back on the same day they got them, which is obviously unrealistic. So we were very concerned. Here we were thinking, aha, we've got it made. We're a vote by mail state. And then suddenly we realized that our vote by mail could be endangered. And if this was the worst case possibility in Oregon, where we have the infrastructure in place to conduct elections by mail, the consequences in other states, of course, might have been very dire indeed. Fortunately, the Postal Service is designed so that changes that affect nationwide mail delivery are supposed to go through a regulatory process that allows for public input. These are not the kinds of things that a Postmaster General can just decide to do and then immediately implement. So I was very pleased to join with my neighbor to the north, Attorney General Ferguson, the Washington AG, and colleagues from a dozen other states in a lawsuit to enjoin these changes. And there have been actually now been 3 or 4 similar lawsuits around the country. And we're all, guess what? We're all winning our lawsuits. As recently as yesterday, the Pennsylvania case, which is pretty much similar to ours, the federal judge ruled in their favor as well. Not quite 2 weeks ago, we obtained the preliminary injunction that we had asked for. So specifically, the judge has ordered the U.S. Postal Service to do all of the following things, and it's 4 main things. 1, abandon the leave mail behind policy, under which postal trucks were required to leave at specified times, even if the mail was nearly ready for them. 2, continue its longstanding practice of treating all election mail as first-class mail, regardless of the paid postage. 3, fix or otherwise replace machines needed to timely process and deliver election mail. And 4, suspend recent policy changes until after the election. So with this injunction in place, I am reasonably confident that our mail election will once again be very successful. But as other panelists will describe in more detail, there remain significant legal issues nationwide surrounding the upcoming election. Advocates are seeking a number of accommodations to enable a meaningful vote during this unprecedented time. And interestingly, a lot of what they are asking for is consistent with Oregon practice after 20 years of successful experimentation and experience, like not requiring mailed ballots to have witness signatures or a notary. And when I say Oregon's experience has been successful, I mean that we have consistently had good, if not great, most of the time, voter turnout, both in primaries and in general elections, and almost 0 voter fraud. There are also several lawsuits challenging the kinds of accommodations that state and local election officials are making in light of the pandemic. And I imagine we will be talking about some of those too during our discussion. But for now, I would just say having an existing vote by mail system means that there is essentially no basis for those types of challenges in Oregon or in Washington or the other vote by mail states. And if anything good can come out of this circumstance, maybe it will be that other states will follow our lead and adopt vote at home, or what's also known as vote by mail, which now has a long track record of avoiding fraud while making it easy for every eligible voter to vote and have their vote counted. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Attorney General Rosenblum. Next, we will hear from Professor Levitt. Justin Levitt is a professor of law and Gerald T. McLaughlin Fellow at Loyola Law School. He was a Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the Civil Rights Division of U.S. Department of Justice, where he primarily supported the Civil Rights Division's work on voting rights and protections. He holds a law degree and a master's degree in public administration from Harvard University. Professor Levitt, can you tell us about your professional and academic experience on these issues and what some of the issues may be going forward?
Sure, and I can try and do that while giving a little bit of context to some of the states that aren't in quite as good a position as Oregon and Washington are. I too first want to say thank you to you, Jamie, and to the ABA and to the section on civil rights and social justice. I've been a civil rights lawyer for a very long time, and in my capacity as an academic, I still consider myself doing civil rights law. So I'm delighted to join you all, and I'm delighted to join my fellow panelists. This is a real all-star group that you've managed to put together, including people who are very much on the front lines of all of these sites in very different ways. You've got Secretary Wyman and Attorney General Rosenblum as state officials on the front lines. You've got Jennifer as a litigator on the front lines. And it's really been a privilege to watch them work on behalf of the voters, all in different ways. Washington and Oregon, I think, have been doing a wonderful job with their own elections so far. No surprise there. They've got a lot of experience at running elections this way. And as you heard from both of them, that experience helps a lot in adjusting to pandemic circumstances because they haven't had to make a lot of adjustments. Their systems actually work pretty well to absorb the massive dislocation the pandemic is providing elsewhere. When you do it right, when you plan for it, misconduct in mail elections is minimal, truly minimal. If you plan for it, mistakes leading to problems in mail elections are also minimal. But not everybody, as you've heard from both of them, not everybody's in the same position as Oregon and Washington are. And just to put that in perspective, a moment of sharing just a few slides about where various groups stand this year. So this is 2016. This is data from the Election Assistance Commission from a survey they run every 2 years just to track the mechanics of casting and counting ballots. You can see there's a wide disparity in the extent to which before this year, states, individuals in states cast ballots by mail. You can see Washington and Oregon very much over on the right-hand side of that graph with close to 100% or nearly 100% of voters casting ballots by mail. Where I'm sitting now in California, we're up hovering around 60%. And 4 states in this category, encouraging, even for states like California, encouraging even more voting by mail is not an insignificant lift, but comparatively easy. There are an awful lot of states in a very different category. And states that have historically had 4, 5, 6% voting by mail, you heard this from both the Secretary and from the Attorney General, are in a very different place when it comes to getting their systems ready. It's not trivial to scale up from 4, 5, or 6% voting by mail to 50 or 60%. And I know, because I've talked to some of the folks on the receiving end of this, I know officials in Washington and Oregon have been helping their counterparts across the country, which is wonderful to see because a lot of people are suddenly in need of that expertise. But it's not just expertise. You need, for example, machinery to suddenly scale up from 10,000 ballots to 1 million ballots that you're counting by mail. This happens to be a ballot sorting machine. It's one of several. It's not the only one on the market, but I show it to you just so that you get a sense of that's not a small desktop piece of machinery. That takes a fair amount of budget and a fair amount of time to order and get up and running to really get your ability to process massive amounts of mail ballots in time. It's not just about machinery either. you have heard some of the litigation over and some of the other adjustments in processes and procedures to helping people cast ballots by mail when there's suddenly a very different scale and a very different volume. Things like ensuring that when you've got a postmark rule, that the post office knows to stamp, to cancel a prepaid envelope is muscle memory for states with long histories of vote by mail, right? They're all in very close contact with local postal officials. It's part of the reason why the Attorney General mentioned the suit against the post office. They know what's going on in their local post offices. New York, historically a state with much less voting by mail, it's not muscle memory there yet. It has now become muscle memory, but they learned the hard way in the primaries that the post office doesn't automatically cancel a stamp when there's no stamp to cancel. And that may mean that ballots aren't automatically postmarked unless you ask for it. Similarly, states without things like same day and automatic voter registration, which both you heard, both Oregon and Washington have a harder time making sure that registration rules stay up to date and current. And that's even more important than usual after a summer in which registration rates dropped because people weren't doing registration rates in large volumes outside at county fairs and the like. And when you're transitioning to much more voting by mail, where small errors in the registration rolls can lead to much bigger problems than you would have while voting at the polls. And it's also true, I think you heard this from the Attorney General, that voters who aren't used to voting by mail, you make mistakes when you do something for the first time. That's always true. And that's no less true in the election process than it is elsewhere. So making sure that states have rules to accommodate those mistakes and making sure that states are proactive in contacting voters to minimize the number of mistakes. I don't know whether you've seen, I hope you've seen, some of the really, really, really creative design work and imagery around informing Pennsylvania voters in the last week or so about the need to use their inner secrecy envelope. It's a ballot goes in an envelope that goes in another envelope. And you've heard a lot more about naked ballots than I think you ever expected to hear in the recent past. That's a good thing because that's actively attempting to educate voters who don't have the experience already in how they can cast ballots that will be counted. Another thing that people are contending with is litigation. Yes, all over the place in order to help accommodate the changes of the pandemic. When the world changed and election rules didn't, that actually sent elections backward. So all of us have had to adjust an awful lot in terms of what we do, how we do, including having this webinar in a studio that most people didn't really have in their home before now. That election rules had to change too in an awful lot of the states that weren't already encouraging voting by mail, where legislators or executive officials either couldn't or wouldn't change the rules in time. And some of them were locked in by state constitutions. I don't mean to suggest that this was always an option everywhere. Voters and those looking out for voters naturally turn to the courts. I've been tracking all of the election litigation related to COVID-19 this year. I'm up to 262 cases in 45 states as of yesterday. I imagine that in the few hours this morning or this afternoon that we've already had, there've been some more cases, so it is constantly running. That can also present a challenge at this point for voters in knowing exactly what the rules are. And I know that conscientious litigants, you're going to hear from Jennifer in a second, are both working in the courts and working to ensure that the same voters on whose behalf they're litigating actually know what the rules are so that they can win or lose, make sure that there's the best possible chance for ballots to count. The thing that's going to keep this election from going awry in states that aren't Oregon or Washington isn't the structure of voting by mail. The structure actually works. The system works when it's given the opportunity to work. The US Postal Service can handle the volume when they want to, and steps like the AGs are helping them want to. The vote by mail processing works to keep things safe and secure. As you heard from Secretary Wyman, there are lots of ways to make sure that you are who you say you are when you count your ballot and that ballot is counted. The thing that's going to keep this election out of the hands of the lawyers in a system that increasingly relies on voting by mail is encouraging voters to make a plan. It's really simple. It takes 5 minutes. It's not much more than knowing what you want to order for dinner before you step to the front of the line or before a waiter's standing there tapping on a pad. Check your voter registration. Find out the rules in your state to know whether you can vote by mail or whether you can vote early and how you do that, because the rules are different everywhere. And then do it as early as you possibly can, one way or another. And that's going to keep things, those 3 simple steps will keep things smooth. Even as voting's a little bit different in a pandemic year, it doesn't have to be disruptive. One last point I want to make, and this may be a little bit of a transition. We've been talking about voting by mail and all of the things that states are doing and will need to do in order to make sure they can vote by mail effectively or increase voting by mail. But all of that effort in voting by mail is designed to relieve pressure on polling locations and poll workers and on in-person options. A.G. Rosenblum mentioned in Oregon, you can go to your county elections office and vote in person if you want or need to. And that is really important as a fail-safe. There are, just like there are communities that are hard to count in the census, there are communities that are hard to mail. Communities that for cultural reasons or for sociological reasons desperately want to be able to count their ballots in person, to vote in person. Minority communities, language minority communities in particular, disability communities. There are plenty of reasons why people may want to be able to vote in person as well. The push to voting by mail has really, this year, has really been to ensure that there's space for those people who want to vote in person, given limitations on locations, given limitations on poll workers. So it's creating the space for people to show up in person when they want, rather than exclusively using the mail and shutting down all in-person options. And that's really important to remember. It also makes the ABA's program on recruiting poll workers really, really important to participate in. And I am overjoyed that the ABA has done that. Law schools are following suit. So in 2018, Loyola Law School, where I teach, actually was, I think, the second school in the country to cancel classes on election day in order to specifically push students out to work at the polls. We have an integrated program with our local registrar here, where law students are volunteering to serve as poll workers. An awful lot of other schools have joined us this year across the country. And so it's really important to remember, even as we make shifts so that more people can vote by mail, and I think both the Secretary and the Attorney General are right, a lot of people are going to want to continue doing that after this year. We still make sure that there are options for those who have to or really want to vote in person to be able to do so safely and smoothly and calmly. And I hope there's a lot more time to discuss all that in the Q&A.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Justin. Now we will hear from attorney Jennifer Holmes. Jennifer serves as assistant counsel with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, where she works on cases that advance racial justice in the areas of educational equity, economic justice, and voting rights. Jennifer received her JD from Stanford Law School and her BA from Yale University with distinction in political science. Ms. Holmes, can you tell us about some of the civil rights and other legal issues that you are currently addressing or that may be developing in the near future?
Yes, and first let me thank the ABA and the section and you, Jamie, for inviting me and hosting this wonderful panel. I'm so proud to be part of this esteemed panel. I feel a little bit out of my league to be with such great academics as well as elected officials. Before I dive into some of the litigation that LDF, my organization, has been doing around absentee voting and vote by mail and expanding options for voters during the pandemic, I'd like to just make a historical note about what voting rights litigation looked like pre-pandemic and that we're still trying to do, as Justin alluded to. Many of you are probably familiar with the Voting Rights Act, which unfortunately the Supreme Court gutted Section 5, which we see as the crown jewel of the Voting Rights Act in a case called Shelby County versus Holder in 2013. And the reason why Section 5 was so wonderful is because for jurisdictions and states that were covered, meaning they had a history of discrimination in voting, they had to get any voting changes, any election changes pre-cleared and approved by the Department of Justice before they could actually implement them. And they had to demonstrate that these changes would not have a disparate impact on minority voters. This was a prophylactic. And so it meant that voting rights and civil rights lawyers no longer had to play a game of whack-a-mole, whereby a state or jurisdiction could institute a poll tax or a literacy test or a jelly bean jar counting test or an 8-box test or every single permutation. And then the lawyers had to go case by case in trying to get those struck down. All along, elections passed and voters were subjected to those disenfranchising practices. This ensured that the changes to election laws were not discriminatory before they were implemented. But unfortunately, that is not the litigation. We don't have that in our toolbox anymore as litigators because of the Shelby County case. And so we are back in part to this whack-a-mole approach where lawyers are trying to sue every discriminatory practice that is put into place after it's already in effect. And so that is the circumstance under which we were laboring even pre-pandemic. And we are still doing this kind of voting rights litigation, now entered the pandemic, where in a slight reversal, we are actually pushing some jurisdictions to implement changes because we realize that voters need a more expanded set of options in order to safely exercise the right to vote. We think that Washington and Oregon have done a wonderful job in, even before the pandemic, giving their voters the opportunity to use vote by mail. And as you saw by the graphs that have been put up by others, there are many, many states that still do not have that option. And so those are some of the jurisdictions where we've been operating. And if you give me a brief moment, I'm going to share my screen and just show you a couple slides on that. Okay, I hope you can all see my screen here. So I'm going to talk about 3 cases that LDF has been litigating recently to expand absentee ballot access. First, a case in Louisiana. Now, Louisiana had very limited excuses for reasons that people could use to request an absentee ballot before the pandemic. It was incredibly limited, and they also did not have a lot of opportunities for people to vote early. And so we sued because we feel that no one should have to choose between their exercising their right to vote and also their health. We wanted to make sure that Louisianans could we actually pushed for no excuse absentee voters so that all Louisianans could, if they so choose, vote absentee and wouldn't have to go to the polls in person. This would also relieve pressure on the polls because it meant that people who preferred to vote in person and perhaps were healthy and felt safe doing so would not be at crowded polling places. And we also sought an increase in the number of early voting days to also act as a release valve on the pressure on the polls on election day. Thankfully, we secured a good court ruling in this case. The judge ruled that the reasons to request an absentee ballot had to be expanded. We didn't get everything that we want. You still have to have a stated reason, but the list is much longer than it was before. You'll see on this slide that the reasons now include anyone who's higher risk from COVID-19 due to underlying medical conditions, anyone under a quarantine order, anyone with symptoms of COVID-19 who is seeking medical confirmation of whether they have it, and anyone who is taking care of a person who is isolating. All those are now additional reasons you can request an absentee ballot in Louisiana because of our lawsuit. Now, I should also note that this is still nowhere near universal vote by mail that other states have. We're still a far cry from Washington and Oregon, but this is a huge expansion from what we had before. In addition, the court ruled that Louisiana had to expand its number of early vote days to 10 days before the election. And so we think this is really important because, again, our goal was to give voters options. We're not saying that everyone must vote by mail or everyone must go in person, but that people have options so they can decide, given their health, given their schedule, and given their, if they need assistance with voting, how they choose to exercise their right to vote. Similarly, in South Carolina, LDF sued and was pushing the state to allow no excuse absentee voting, and also to eliminate the witness signature requirement that it has on absentee ballots. I believe Attorney General Rosenblum mentioned that in Oregon, there's no witness requirement. But in South Carolina, if you are completing an absentee ballot before this lawsuit, you had to find a person to act as a witness, to watch you sign it, and then they had to sign it and put their address on it. Of course, this is not ideal under our current social distance lifestyle to find another person to come to your home and do this. Many people live alone, not even people who live with others. Some people may not feel comfortable witnessing a ballot, and some people didn't want to provide their address as a witness. So we said that this witness signature requirement was also a burden on people who were trying to exercise their right to vote remotely. Because of our case, well, I think it's because of our case, the South Carolina legislature actually moved before we got a ruling in this case, and they decided that they would allow no excuse absentee voting. So now any South Carolinian who wants to can request an absentee ballot. And I think this illustrates the importance of litigation is not always in securing a court order. Sometimes it's in applying pressure so that the elected officials or the Secretary of State or whoever will take action that you're requesting, even if you don't get a court ruling. That kind of source of pressure, we think, can be a very valuable tool. However, the legislature didn't budge on the witness requirement, and so we continued litigating. At the same time that our case was going, there was a parallel case brought by the Democratic Party that also was requesting similar relief to ours. And in that case, they got a ruling striking down the witness signature requirement. And so that ruling also applies in our case. And right now, the witness signature requirement is not required for absentee ballots in South Carolina. This case is under appeal, but thankfully, even though it's gone up to appeal and the panel actually stayed the district court decision, it was sua sponte when it went en banc at the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, and they lifted the stay. So right now, the reality on the ground is that there's no witness signature needed. Now, I think as Professor Levitt mentioned, there's a lot of lawsuits going on. There's a lot of changes because of these lawsuits. And so we see our role as twofold. It's very important for us to be in the court expanding access to the ballot, but we also have a very important educational role because not everyone is a huge law nerd following these cases extremely closely, and they may not know that they're in South Carolina now and they don't have to have a witness for their ballot. So LDF also has a number of people, and we work with a number of groups on the ground whose sole job is this sort of voter education, which is a complementary piece to our litigation. And finally, I just want to mention a case that's still ongoing in Alabama, People First versus Merrill. Here, we challenged a couple restrictions that Alabama had on absentee voting, as well as a ban that Alabama had on curbside voting. Now, curbside voting, for those who may not know, is in many places, if you are elderly or if you have an ambulatory problem or any other disability that may make it difficult to actually walk into your polling place, poll workers can set up a curbside voting station where a poll worker will bring out a ballot to you and facilitate you voting from your car window or right up at the curbside. And that makes it easier for older people or people with disabilities to vote. Although this is technically allowed under Alabama law, the Secretary of State was not allowing it to actually be implemented. So we sued to challenge that ban on curbside voting. We also wanted to strike down certain requirements that are that have been put on absentee voting in Alabama, including, again, a witness signature requirement, and also in Alabama, a photo ID requirement. Now, Alabama has a photo ID law. If you go into the polling place to vote, you have to show an ID from a specific list of IDs that are acceptable. But also, if you're voting absentee, you have to provide a Xerox copy of your ID along with your absentee ballot. I don't know how many of you have printers at home. Probably actually many of you because you're lawyers and we're nerds, but the average person does not have a printer at home. It's not have a scanner, and it's pretty difficult for them to adhere to this rule without going out in public and breaking social distancing norms. So that's why we challenged the practice in that case. The current status of this litigation is there was a trial that ended about a week and a half ago, and we filed post-trial briefing, and we are eagerly awaiting a ruling. We are somewhat optimistic because when this case was initially filed over the summer, we actually won a preliminary injunction, which enjoined these various rules that we had challenged. However, that was overturned by the Supreme Court, or that was stayed by the Supreme Court while the case was pending. So now we've gone through the whole litigation and trial, and but we are optimistic that we will get a similar ruling since the judge was on our side at the preliminary injunction stage. So that is just to give you a flavor of some of the litigation that's happening. I think it's difficult because there are many changes happening with voting rules and voting requirements, but it's worth it in our view because voters need more options to exercise their rights during a pandemic. And many of these restrictions, even in non-pandemic times, had a disparate impact on Black voters. Maybe that's because they disproportionately do not have an ID, or they do not fall into the categories that can request absentee ballots. But certainly during the pandemic, when Black Americans have contracted COVID and died from COVID at disproportionate rates, these voting restrictions that make it more difficult for any voter to cast a ballot during the pandemic, the impact on Black voters is magnified even more greatly. And so we saw it as our duty to fight them. I should also mention that we were one of those many groups that also sued the US Postal Service. We're very grateful to the various states attorneys general who secured an injunction in that case, so kind of mooted out our case, but we've also been in that fight as well. And the last thing I wanted to mention, Professor Levitt scooped me on this, but here's how you can get involved. If you are trying to figure out how to navigate the election landscape, this election, first, I'd say start with the personal. Make your own plan to vote. The first website that I've listed here is LDF's voting microsite, voting.naacpldf.org. And I call that the one-stop shop to figure out everything you need to know about voting. It has links to check your registration. It has links where to go if you want to become a poll worker. It has links to rules in various states. It has links to how you can get involved in election protection and poll monitoring. So that's a one-stop shop, but there are many other websites and resources that you can go to. If you'd like to use a government website instead to check your registration, you can go to usa.gov/confirm voter registration, and there are hyphens between confirm voter and registration. And then after you've confirmed that you're registered, and you should do that immediately because registration deadlines are coming up. I think they start as early as this week in various states. And so this year, unless you are in a same-day registration state, you're running out of time to register. Check your registration, make sure you're registered, and then choose your voting method. If you're in a state where you're lucky enough to have universal vote by mail, or maybe you have early voting options, or do you have to actually request an absentee ballot, figure out what options are available to you and which one you want to use. I know already how I plan to vote. I live in Washington, D.C., and I plan to vote early but in person. And early voting starts on October 27th in D.C., and I'm going to go down the street to the rec center and vote. That's my plan. So everyone here should also have a plan where you can just say it like that in 5 seconds. Once you have your plan, figure out exactly what rules you need to abide by. Does your state require an ID? Does your state require specific rules about how to fill out your absentee ballot? Do you have to use the secrecy envelope or not? Things like that. All these things where you can potentially get tripped up, especially if you're using a method that you haven't done before. And I would also recommend, I know there's been some discussion about drop boxes, but given the uncertainty about the Postal Service, if you feel that you don't want to trust your ballot to the mail, your absentee ballot to the mail, and you have drop boxes available to you, use that as your means of delivering your ballot. But whatever you do, make a plan ahead of time so you know exactly how to execute it. And then after you turn in your ballot, you want to follow up. If you sent in a mail ballot, an absentee ballot, you can check the status of it. Many states allow you to track whether the ballot has arrived and whether it's been counted. Some states are required to inform you if there's a problem with your ballot, maybe with a signature or some other rule. You should also follow up if you go to vote in person and you have to vote a provisional ballot. Many states enable you to check on the status of your provisional ballot to see if it was ultimately counted and to see what you can do to cure the problems with your provisional ballot. So your task is not over once the ballot leaves your hands. You want to make sure that it's actually counted. And then once you figured out your own situation, make sure all your family and friends also have a plan and are also doing these things. Finally, I'd like to encourage everyone here to volunteer on election day. We've already mentioned the importance of becoming a poll worker. I'm so excited that the ABA has an initiative on how people can become poll workers. Another option is powerthepolls.org, which is one that LDF has been partnering with, but whichever initiative you use, if you are healthy and able to volunteer to be a poll worker, many states will pay you for the day. I greatly encourage you to do that because our poll worker force, generally speaking, is somewhat older. Many of them are high risk for COVID and are unable or unwilling to work on election day. And so we need to fill the gap. You can also volunteer to do election protection run by the Lawyers Committee. You can also join LDF's Prepared to Vote team. And I've got my Prepared to Vote t-shirt on today. If you go to our microsite that I mentioned, voting.nwacpldf.org, you can figure out how you can do remote poll monitoring, helping us keep track of the issues that are going on in various states. I'll mention that this effort mostly covers about 9 states in the South that have historically had the kind of worst voter discrimination problems. That's where we're focused on prepared to vote. But you can help us connect with groups on the ground, or if you're in one of those states, you can be our eyes and ears on the ground on election day to connect with us. And we want you to report any issues that you're seeing. And finally, even after election day, please stay engaged. In this post-Shelby County world, we need everyone, but especially attorneys, to be the front line against voter suppression in your communities. As attorneys, you are uniquely equipped with the tools and the sophistication to report issues that are going on, to garner media attention, to petition local governments, to provide testimony, all sorts of things that shine a light on where there are issues in our elections. And as many of you know, voter suppression can take many forms. It can do with rule changes that may seem somewhat arcane, but actually have very disparate impacts on minority communities. It can just be the fact that no one knows about those rule changes. It can be forms of mismanagement that have no nefarious intent behind them at all, but simply the fact that at a polling place, the machines break down, or at a certain precinct, they don't get the funding that provides for enough machines, all sorts of things. So We need lawyers to be attuned to these issues and to report them and to engage in the places where decisions are being made about these issues. And finally, I'd encourage you to be a poll worker every election, not just this election, but the more you do it, the more you will become experienced and knowledgeable about it. And then we will have a future army of poll workers and we can finally allow our current poll workers to retire from the job. So I'm going to end there with those calls to action. But thanks again, and I look forward to any Q&A.
And Jamie, if I can just add one tiny little thing to Jennifer's last point, the
Please.
only way that we increase the possibility for systemic change in some of the jurisdictions that are not quite as advanced is if we're all just as interested in reforming the way we conduct elections a month after the election as we are right now. So precisely what Jennifer said, the election officials know this is an ongoing, we don't have elections once every 4 years or once every 2 years, we have elections all the time. We need to stay engaged and interested in the election process to make sure that they're as fair as can be all the time. So don't just wait until November 3rd or thereafter when we have a result in the presidential election and tune out. We really need everybody here to be just as engaged the month after the election as the month before.
Excellent. Thank you, Justin. And thank you so much, Jennifer, for those comments and that call to action, and also especially for the resources that you shared. Now that we've had a chance to get a good overview of the issues from our excellent panel, we'd like to open it up for any questions from the audience. And as a reminder, please type your questions into the Q&A and not the chat function. Thank you. And thank you so much to our panelists who have already been hard at work responding to many of the questions that have been popping up. So I will do my best here to pull up some of the questions for our panelists. To get started, Attorney General Rosenblum mentioned the recent injunctive victories in court. Could you comment on any concerns of whether USPS may comply or not with these with the injunctions? Or and also, has the equipment removed or destroyed been replaced in those affected states? Do you have status on states other than Oregon?
Thank you for those questions, and thanks for putting them all together like that, Jamie. And of course, if you get an injunction and you get the relief, you want to make sure that they comply, right? You want to be able to come back and hold them in contempt if they don't. So how do you do that? How do we know under these circumstances, right? Well, here's one way, and I can't make any guarantees, but we are watching them closely. And the judge, I'm sure, will be, welcome us back, if you will, if need be. But here's one thing we've done, and that is, as you know, in lawsuits, you have to get declarants, right? To tell you in affidavits that are then attached to the pleadings what their experience is. And a number of our declarants are postal union workers. So postal union workers are on the inside. They're watching. And guess what? The Postal Service knows that there are declarants. So they know that we essentially have, if you will, moles there to keep a watch on what they're doing and whether they are in compliance. And we feel that we will be apprised if we learn that they are not in compliance. Now, as to the question about the machines, unfortunately, if you followed some of the testimony of the Postmaster General, I think one of the things he has made clear is that some of those machines, maybe most of the sorting machines, have been essentially dismantled and, the equivalent of sold for parts. So no, we don't have any assurance that that the Postal Service can literally put things back the way they were before, to ensure that all the mail will be handled as quickly and as deftly as it has been previously. I wish I could give you that reassurance. I think there was a third part to the question. Well, hopefully I came close to answering it, but I guarantee you, we will go back to court and we will do everything in our power to ensure that the provisions of the injunction are complied with.
Great. Thank you so much, AG. Another question, what can be done about states that purge voters and don't let the voters know? Checking registration is important, but it's not necessarily the case that people will be able to re-register in time to vote. Anyone like to tackle that?
Okay, I'll jump in, I suppose. I think this is why it is so critical, as you heard from our speakers, to have a plan, check right now. Really encourage those people who you influence and that you're connected to just verify with election officials right now, because some of those voter registration cutoffs are approaching in some states quickly. And once they pass, the voter will be out of luck. You know, I'm happy to say here in Washington, we don't purge voters. We haven't purged voters since 1993 when I first started here, and we don't intend to in the future either. We want to comply with federal law. Call me crazy.
So I'll add to that. Just because you think you're registered doesn't mean you're actually registered at the right place. So what the secretary said is exactly right. Check your registration. Even if you think you've got it, check it again. Can't possibly hurt, and it's really quick. There are a lot of resources nationwide to go check your registration, and it doesn't take long at all. Most states make that available online, and it's super quick so that you can check. The second thing is, and this is stay engaged after the election, that's absolutely the right answer for anybody voting November 3rd, right? Go get the word out, check now. Longer term, putting procedures in place like Oregon and Washington have, automatic voter registration and same-day voter registration as a fail-safe, that helps make the rolls as accurate as they can be, and it helps make sure that you don't have to purge people off the rolls, exactly as the secretary just said. If it's the state's responsibility to check up and make sure that you're registered correctly in the right place, and both automatic registration and same-day registration help make that happen continuously so you don't get a flood of changes at the very last minute. Turns out to be more accurate, turns out to be more secure, turns out to be a lot cheaper. And so fewer of your tax dollars go to paying temps to process voter registration cards in a flood in the final days before election day. So it should be something everybody can support. It turns out that red states and blue states and purple states have done it. The only way it spreads to more states in all of those categories is if you care about it.
Thank you.
The only thing I would add to this is what everyone's saying is completely correct, especially for this upcoming election. The way to figure out if you've been removed from the list is to check your registration now, before the registration deadline passes in your state. In the future, as Professor Levitt was mentioning, you know, if you are involved in seeing what your Secretary of State is doing, what your state legislature is doing, if you attend hearings or sort of follow the issues on this, you can know what practices they're putting in place that might govern future potential purges, whether they are creating an inactive voter list or whether they are sending out postcards that they claim will confirm whether or not you are still living in the state. And you can get in on the front end and have some input on whether that practice is going to actually take effect. So staying engaged, you'll know ahead of time before these issues sneak up on us with election day looming.
Great, thank you. Have you noticed any foreign interference with voter registration or voting so far?
We have not seen any foreign interference, and we have not had. In 2020, I just don't want to say things out loud because you just jinx them. But we have not seen any evidence of any kind of compromises of our system here in Washington State. But make no mistake, what you've heard and what you've read over the last 4 years, there has been a concentrated, ongoing, nonstop effort by foreign actors, including Russia, China, and Iran, to try to get into state and local election offices, voter registration systems, or anything they can. We have been really focused for the last 4 years with a laser focus on securing our system, and I know that it's happening in all 50 states. So when I talk about Washington, the same things are happening in their states. Much more firewalls, monitoring equipment, cybersecurity conversations that are happening with our federal partners and our local partners and our state partners, training, putting simple things like multi-factor authentication to doing tabletop exercises. So the effort has been incredibly ongoing, and now we are ready for whatever is coming our way. And Yes, we've been under attack and we continue to be, but we're fighting it off, and we're going to protect everyone's vote. That's really the bottom line.
And vote by mail helps because it's paper, right? We have paper ballots to back up any system that gets hacked.
Good point.
I'll just add to what both of the, I'm sorry, Jennifer, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, let me take the broader perspective of foreign interference. It's not just about potential hacks. It's also about spreading misinformation, which is why it's so important to get, as Secretary Wyman mentioned, to get your information from a trusted source, to make sure that you are thinking critically about what your media diet is. If everything you're getting is from postings on Facebook, do you know that those are trusted sources? Because some of those are coming from foreign actors that are trying to spread misinformation or influence people and influence their vote.
So thanks, Jennifer. That's exactly what I was going to say, and she said it better than I did. In 2016, we got to remember, we got hacked, but it wasn't the ballots, it wasn't the machines, it wasn't the tallies, it was us. They hacked us, the people, and the information we believed and what we got really excited about. And in that sense, we were and continue to be the weak link. That also means that we are the source of strength, because all of us have individual agency to do exactly what Jennifer mentioned, to be careful about our media diet, to be careful about information before we pass it on, to take a deep breath before we respond to things. So it turns out that if what they're hacking is us, we can each respond to that with a little bit of patience and a little bit of thought. And that's actually the most security that you could ask for.
Excellent, thank you. So next question, how is the confusion about voting twice going to be handled? I've heard folks say they're confused because they're receiving mixed messages about voting, submitting an absentee ballot, and then in person. How will these discrepancies be resolved?
Through tweets responding that you should not, that it's illegal to vote twice, that you should not vote twice, and that this attempt to confuse voters and to somehow enlist them to test the system is absolutely wrong, improper, actually illegal.
And gets caught. So every state, every single one has a system for not only deterring people who vote twice through prosecution, but also for making sure that the rolls are checked off whenever the first ballot is cast so that the second ballot doesn't count. In some places, the ballot that counts is the ballot you cast in person. In other places, it's the absentee ballot. That changes state by state, but every state's got a system to make sure that you can't actually vote twice and have it be effective. And as the AG just said, every state makes it illegal. Federal law makes it illegal.
Yeah, I would just dovetail on that, especially with this many lawyers in one place at one time. You combat this garbage with the facts. When I understand that the president is very frustrated with states like mine and is not happy with my answers, and that's okay. I'm okay with that. We just keep combating it with the facts. And one of the facts we have to share with people is it is a felony, I believe, in every single state to attempt to vote more than once. Well, it's not a felony to attempt to vote more than once, but you all know, you're lawyers, but making people aware of that, just this idea to go check and test the system is asking people to commit a felony. And we've tried to share that information on every platform we can, and we'll just continue to beat that drum. And it goes back to what Jennifer was saying, is that we have to continue to provide trusted information through the sources and channels we have available. And we have now we have to ramp up our activity. We were all planning to do it. Now is the time we have to start ramping it up and get that information out to people.
Yes, thank you all. That's very helpful. Jennifer, this one may be for you. The question is, are any of you working on litigation to address the poll tax being imposed on people convicted of felonies who have been given the right to vote, but states are now requiring restitution, court fines or fees, etc., be paid before they can vote? And I'll just add quickly that in our state, in Washington, we changed the law over 10 years ago so that we call them legal financial obligations, but fines and fees do not need to be paid before someone's right to vote is automatically restored. Would you like to take that?
Yeah, I'd love to address that because I am working on that litigation actually in Florida specifically. Um, Unfortunately, we recently received a bad ruling from the 11th Circuit that did not see things our way, that linking the payment of people's legal financial obligations to their ability to vote, they said was not a poll tax and did not burden the fundamental right to vote. But the silver lining, I guess, is there are still ways to help because there are many campaigns in place to fundraise and help people pay off their legal financial obligations so that they can register and vote. And it's not just about this election, which is certainly important, but moving forward, we want to there are studies that show that when a person who has committed a felony is more likely to become a constructive member of the community and really re-enter their community if they have their civil rights and their voting rights restored. If they don't carry additional collateral consequences with them from the time they were incarcerated that make it more difficult to obtain work, to vote, to obtain housing. And so we would, encourage you to look into these efforts to help pay off people's legal financial obligations. And although the litigation right now is not will likely not be resolved before this election, it's not totally over necessarily. So stay tuned on that.
And I know there was a related question in the Q&A about where to contribute to these efforts to pay off the debts. The Florida Rights Restoration Coalition has been one of the primary engines in helping individuals pay off those debts. And so I'll drop the link in the chat, but you can find more information there.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Justin. And in addition to the litigation, we need to work with our state legislatures to change these laws and repeal these practices. It's 2020. We need to eliminate these sort of poll taxes, arguably, as they are. Another question here, is there one clearinghouse nationally that holds all voting rights litigation? What is the best way to compile data on voting rights claims, since there are now many state causes of action, instead of just using PACER to find federal causes of action? Any thoughts on that?
So I've got a couple quick thoughts, and then I'll leave it to others who may know of other resources. I dropped a link in the chat. I'm trying to track all of the COVID-19 related election litigation this year. That's a mammoth set. That's by no means all litigation, including, for example, Jennifer's case about felony disenfranchisement and re-enfranchising people with convictions, not related to the pandemic, but incredibly important, isn't on my list. Michigan has a great civil rights litigation clearinghouse that tries to track voting litigation when it exists. The Ohio School of Law, the Moritz School of Law at Ohio State, has another litigation tracker that tries to track particularly prominent cases. But the question reflects how difficult it is actually to track state law cases in particular. We still, in the 21st century, don't have, in many states, particularly accessible ways to get hold of court documents or even litigation generally that's been brought dockets. So it's difficult.
I would add that the Brennan Center has a very good website with lots of great information. And if you would like, through the Democratic Attorney General Association, we're trying to keep track of state and local cases, and I might be able to put that together for you and provide it as a link. I can't do it right this moment, but I will look into it because I check it every day. It's very helpful.
On the topic of tracking, this actually doesn't have to do with litigation, voting rights litigation, but LDF has been tracking, and I won't say this is fully comprehensive, but election and voting changes, rule changes, practice changes in states that were formerly covered by Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. We have a report called Democracy Diminished, and we update it kind of after every large election about problems that we're seeing that probably would have been prevented if we still had Section 5 operating as it did before. So if anyone's interested in that, I will try to find a link and drop it in the chat.
Excellent. I am so sorry we're not able to get to everyone's questions. We'll do our best. We have these obviously in the chat, and we'll try to respond as we can. And the panelists, I know how busy they are, but they may be willing to share a few thoughts on a couple of your questions. We have time for one more, so I wanted to see if there was a question in particular that any of our panelists would like to address.
I saw one that I think is a great way. I don't want to make it the one to end on, so if others have other favorites, please note. But there was one asking about, somebody had a voter registration rally today for potential voters ages 18 to 25, and what we should tell them to help them engage to register. So I'll just take a stab at that, and then maybe others can contribute. And if there are other questions that people want to answer, please, I don't mean to monopolize. This one just seemed important because voting is a habit, and voting is habit forming. And so the more you can get younger voters to step up and take part, the more likely it is that they become lifelong voters. It's really not hard to register to vote, but it can seem like a barrier if you don't have somebody bringing you with you for the initial step. So help them take that initial step. All it takes is a very small holding hand, but help them take that initial step. There are lots of resources. If there are plenty of government sites that you saw in the chat. Every state has individual resources. And if you Google, how do I register? There's actually a really good comprehensive list that'll pop up for the person in their state about how they can best register to vote. So give them a little bit of nudge. I think they'll take that opportunity and turn into lifelong voters, which we really need more of.
And I just like to put in a final plug for the vote at home system. Stop thinking about it as vote by mail, because there's so many different ways to cast the ballot after you've had the time with your family to go over the ballot. You can bring your kids into the kitchen, have them sit around and actually have a civics lesson. You know, people are feeling a little nostalgic for the polls. Forget about it. It's way more fun, and you have a lot more time, and it's relaxing, and you'll do a better job. You'll make a more informed decision about your vote. And then you take it to the drop box, or you put it in the mail, or you take it to the election office. You have so many different ways of voting. The important thing is vote. And as Jennifer said, make your plan now. Make sure if you need to change your registration or your address. Here in Oregon, we've had wildfires. We have people who've been evacuated. They have to change their address. We're helping them to do that. We have people who live under bridges who are homeless. We're helping them to vote. We have people on Indian reservations. We're bringing shuttles into town for them to be sure that they are comfortable casting their vote. There are so many different ways to vote, but please vote. Thank you.
I would just dovetail.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
On the make a vote plan, feel free to, I believe my slides are part of the materials for this webinar. So feel free to save the slide I have on making a plan to vote and use it as a checklist.
Absolutely. And I echo all of my colleagues' comments. And I would just add, because one of the questions in the Q&A was, those of you in Washington and Oregon, we don't have places for people to work on election day. Actually, we have a big need for election workers. It varies by county. Here in Washington, we have a project called the Vote Squad, as in, you know, like, I'm dating myself, but I think the Mod Squad, but whatever. Anyway, those of you old enough to remember will get that reference. But it is really designed to try to connect people with counties and fill in those needs, because we do have 500 drop boxes that need to be closed at 8 o'clock election night, and there are needs out there, even though we don't have traditional polling places. And I'm sure Oregon is the same way.
Somebody asked a question about postmarking. If you use a drop box, you don't have to worry about postmarks if you use a drop box. It's not mailed in ballot. So just to be clear, you don't need to worry. No postmarks necessary.
Excellent.
One more thing, Jamie, I'm so sorry, which is that there in the chat and in the Q&A, there've been a ton of really great questions, especially about specific states and jurisdictions that I certainly don't know off the top of my head, but I would encourage everyone to just read through those, because you might think, oh, I want this in my state. I want curbside voting, or I want universal mail-in voting, or whatever it is. Or maybe I have it already and I just don't know. and use that as to just make you think of initiatives you should push for, like automatic voter registration, other things. So even the chat and the Q&A here, I think, are fertile ground for people to use as for things they'd like to advocate in the future.
Excellent. Thank you all so much. And to the audience, we know we're almost at time, but if you can stick with us just a few more minutes, we have a short video that we want to share with you. And if you need to leave now, we also understand that too. So there are 35 days until Election Day. As we know, early voting is underway in some states. As lawyers, we have a heightened duty to protect our democracy and the rule of law. I hope everyone will do what they can to ensure every eligible citizen has a safe and fair opportunity to cast their vote. As you've heard throughout the panel today, it is crucial that we have enough poll workers on November 3rd, and some states need volunteers to help count votes after that day. For details in your state, check your local election officials. Quickly, I wanted to mention, in an effort to help recruit poll workers in Ohio, the Ohio Supreme Court has unanimously approved a novel plan that would turn Ohio lawyers in the state into volunteer poll workers for a day at general election sites on November 3rd. In return, participating attorneys will get credit toward their mandatory continuing education obligations. We hope more states will follow this great lead, as the Ohio Supreme Court has recently done. And before we close out, let's mention we want to take just a couple of minutes to share a video about the Poll Worker Esquire initiative recently launched by the ABA to encourage lawyers and law students across the country to ensure voting is safe and efficient and that all eligible votes are counted. This video is available at canivote.org.
Hello, I'm Trish Rifo, President of the American Bar Association. The ABA is excited to work with the National Association of Secretaries of State, the National Association of State Election Directors, and state bar associations across the country to recruit lawyers and law students like you to serve as poll workers.
With the 2020 general election approaching, my office and local election officials have been working around the clock to recruit poll workers.
While a record number of votes are likely to be cast by mail this year, polling locations will remain open across the country, and we anticipate a shortage of poll workers.
That's why we need you, yes you, to become a poll worker today.
Elections are quintessential to our democracy. This fall, as millions of Americans are exercising their civic duty, we are counting on you to help ensure that the voting process is safe, efficient, and that all eligible votes are counted.
Your local election leaders are ready to provide all the necessary training.
The ABA Young Lawyers Division is rallying our members and our profession to step up and relieve the country's mostly older poll workers of the threat of exposure to the novel coronavirus.
We are launching a poll worker recruitment among lawyers because lawyers are ideally suited to be poll workers. And this is a tremendous civic duty that we all have to participate.
You need not be a licensed attorney to serve as a poll worker. Law students are encouraged to join in this important effort.
During this unprecedented time, we understand that you may be anxious to serve as a poll worker.
However, in cooperation with the local election authorities, we are taking extensive precautions to ensure your health and safety, as well as that of the voters.
Together, we can do our part to support the 2020 election and launch the next generation of poll workers for years to come.
To learn more about becoming a poll worker, you can start by visiting the nonpartisan canivote.org and clicking on the Become a Poll Worker page.
Thank you, and I hope you'll consider lending your talents to the democratic process for the November 2020 election.
Thank you all again for joining this free webinar. We'd like to express our gratitude to this esteemed group of panelists. You're all doing such critical work, and we thank you for taking the time out to share your experiences and perspectives today. As I mentioned at the beginning, the section of Civil Rights and Social Justice is providing these free webinars and resources for legal professionals and advocates nationwide on countless issues addressing broad range of civil rights and civil liberties and international human rights. We hope this helps you in your work. And again, please consider joining us and becoming active in the ABA. Thank you again to all of our panelists and all of you. Best of luck in your work. Stay safe, everybody. Make a plan for how you will vote and do it. And please vote early. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.